When two polar bears unexpectedly appear at an abandoned house in a small, remote village, the locals quickly reach out for assistance in managing the situation. Scientist Adrian Blake arrives first on the scene, assigned to investigate why these animals have come to this house and why they are reluctant to leave. Unraveling the mystery would require a heroic effort. It was not a coincidence that the polar bears ended up here. Adrian's legs shook as he walked through the dark, abandoned house, with only the small light from his phone to guide him. He knew the two polar bears were nearby and hoped they were asleep. As he looked around, he didn't see anything unusual that could have brought the bears there. When Adrian reached the bedroom and opened the door, everything became clear. The two polar bears were lying fast asleep, and between them was what had drawn them to the house. Adrian never expected to find this. He wondered how the bears had arrived, what had attracted them, and why he was so determined to find out. The villagers were shocked when the polar bears suddenly appeared. It was the first time anything like this had happened in their small town. No one knew where the bears had come from. They only knew that the animals had entered one of the old abandoned houses. The people living nearby were too scared to approach the bears, so those close to the house chose to stay with friends instead. Somebody had to get the animals out of there, but they also needed to find out why they came in the first place. It was a big question for them. Why were the bears in their small town? It was well known that the village was fairly difficult to reach. It would take special animal handlers a couple of days at least to get everything they needed to the location. But who showed up much sooner than everyone else was a scientist named Adrian. He was a specialist in wild animals, so he could be really helpful in this kind of situation. When he first heard about these two polar bears being so far from their natural habitat, he was extremely curious about the reason for it. It was at least a 10-hour drive, but he couldn't miss this chance. He didn't hesitate for a moment and left the very next morning. He wanted to save these bears and help them return to where they came from. On the way, he made calls to colleagues and tried to set up a plan of approach. Even if he was all alone, he wanted to know the reason why these animals were there. He was worried that it would be really difficult, but as it turned out, it would go relatively smoothly. After a long trip, he finally arrived in the village. There was no doubt as to which house he needed to be at. The citizens had taken it upon themselves to set out caution tape around it. It did not take long before Adrian first saw the reason he had come all this way. He was excited because he thought it would be an interesting case. On the porch of the house and in front of the window, he saw them, two relatively small polar bears. He felt his heart skip a beat. It was the first time in his life that he had seen one of these magnificent creatures up close. This could be the most beautiful moment of his professional career. Adrian was thrilled about this new adventure. However, after a couple of minutes of excitement, fear also set in. He wanted nothing more than to get inside the house and figure out what had attracted these animals. But for that, he would need to enter the house. It was not the easiest thing to do because he didn't know how the bears would behave. First, he wanted to figure out something else. He knew very well that polar bears aren't native to this area of the world. So where did these two come from? He had already checked, and there were no zoos around the place, so they couldn't have escaped from there. He also checked if there were any listed private owners, but he found nothing. So, it was a huge mystery for him where these bears had come from. Talking to the locals, Adrian found out that nobody had seen the bears arriving in the village, but many of the villagers had their theories. It was quite normal for them to come up with ideas and theories about the bears because it was the first time something like this had happened in their small village. They needed an easy explanation. According to some of them, it was the first time they had seen these animals around here. They claimed to have seen them from a distance in the forest while hiking or hunting, but nobody was sure. They might have just been seeing things. Adrian felt lost among all these opinions and had no clue if any of them were telling the truth. These sightings of the bears dated back at least 10 years, but they probably only added up to about 8 years. Nobody had discussed them before, as they were afraid people would think they had gone crazy, since seeing polar bears around was nearly impossible. That was a fact until 2 days ago. The most likely scenario was that these bears had been surviving around here for a while. Adrian was still unsure how they could have gotten here in the first place. He suspected there might have been some human involvement, but he didn't know exactly how humans could affect these two polar bears. If these bears had been here for a long time, what had attracted them to this old house? The villagers told him that the house had been this way for years. No one had lived in it for as long as they could remember. It was not strange at all that the bears chose a house without people because they wanted to feel safe. The house was in such bad condition that nobody had any interest in restoring it. It would most likely cost a lot more money than it would ever bring in. So for many years, nobody had lived in this old house. At least, that is what they believed all this time. All of these findings and stories Adrian heard only made him more curious about what could possibly be inside this old and empty house. After some days of thinking and talking, Adrian and some locals came up with a brilliant new plan. It was his only chance to find out what had happened to this old house and why the bears had chosen this place. Their best chance of entering the house was when the animals were both asleep, but they needed a way to almost guarantee this. If the bears were not asleep, it would pose a serious problem for them. They wanted to protect themselves because even if these polar bears were small, it didn't mean they were not wild animals. The villagers decided to take turns staying near the house and making a lot of noise to keep the bears from sleeping at all. They wanted to exhaust the animals so they would fall asleep more easily and deeply. However, this did come with some potentially dangerous consequences for their safety. The polar bears were starting to get angrier and angrier, and there was a good chance they could lash out at the people making all the noise. Fortunately, they had developed some safety plans. It was a tough strategy, and they wanted to be ready for anything. They decided that the person making noise near the house would never be alone. There would always be someone or a car nearby, ready to help if the polar bears came out to attack. This way, the person could be quickly taken to safety. Luckily, and oddly, this situation never occurred. Even though the polar bears seemed very angry at the noise, they still wouldn't leave the house. This made it clear to Adrian that entering the house while the bears were still there was his only option. He knew it would be difficult and dangerous, but he chose to take the risk. When Adrian finally entered the house and reached the bedroom where the polar bears were sleeping, he found that one of them had given birth to cubs. She likely didn't want to leave because she was trying to protect her babies. In the end, animal rescue services successfully removed all the polar bears and took them to a large zoo where they could live comfortably for the rest of their days. The house remains abandoned and will likely stay that way until nature reclaims it. What do you think of this story? Let us know in the comments section. I hope you liked this video. Please give it a thumbs up and share it with your loved ones. Also subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss the update from our channel. Thank you.